Today is Thursday, May 28th, 2026, and today is National Hamburger Day, which honestly might be one of the few national food holidays nobody really argues with. There are some foods where people debate quality, people debate authenticity, people debate ingredients, but the basic idea of hot meat on bread has survived remarkably well internationally, which actually fits today's episode more than I expected. Because May 28th kept circling back to one strange idea. The world suddenly became more connected, more reachable, and occasionally much smaller than people expected. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and a person who keeps discovering that history is somehow both fascinating and deeply concerning at the same time. On May 28, 1937, Volkswagen was officially founded in Germany. And today, the company feels so globally familiar it's easy to forget how unusual the original concept sounded. Because Volkswagen literally translates to the people's car. The idea was simple: build a reliable automobile affordable enough for ordinary citizens, which at the time was still somewhat ambitious. Cars existed, of course. But in many places, they were still associated with wealth, status, or specialized industrial use. The vision behind Volkswagen was different. This was supposed to be mass mobility, a practical machine regular families could own. And one of the strangest things about early automobile history is how quickly people emotionally attached themselves to cars once they became accessible. Because cars didn't just change transportation. They changed scale. Distances shrank. Towns felt closer. Road trips became realistic. Entire industries reorganized themselves around the assumption that people could suddenly travel farther, faster, and more independently. And once that shift starts happening, societies began redesigning themselves around movement. Restaurants change. Cities change. Dating changes. Vacations change. Suburbs expand. Roadside attractions appear. Even people's relationship with home changes once movement becomes easy enough. And Volkswagen entered that exact moment. Of course, the company's origins are also deeply tied to Nazi Germany, which makes the history more complicated than the cheerful image many people associate with the later Volkswagen Beetle. Because history regularly does this uncomfortable thing where objects survive long after the systems surrounding their creation disappear. And over time, the Beetle eventually became associated with almost the complete opposite cultural image. Counterculture, road trips, youth culture, freedom, small practical charm, which is honestly a strange transformation from a machine born from authoritarian-era industrial planning, but maybe that's part of why the Beetle became so memorable. It felt human-sized, simple, recognizable, almost friendly. And once enough people emotionally connect to an object, it stops feeling mechanical and starts feeling personal. But if the cars made the world feel smaller horizontally, spaceflight suddenly made the world feel smaller vertically. On May 28, 1959, two monkeys named Abel and Baker survived a trip into space. For a brief moment, they became international celebrities. Before human beings went into space, scientists needed to answer a terrifying question. Could a living creature survive launch, weightlessness, extreme acceleration, and re-entry? Because nobody actually knew. There were serious concerns about breathing, heart function, consciousness, radiation, and whether the stress might simply overwhelm the body entirely. So before astronauts came animals. Dogs, monkeys, mice, fruit flies. And on this particular mission, Abel and Baker rode aboard a Jupiter missile launched from Cape Canaveral. Abel was a rhesus monkey. Baker was a squirrel monkey, which somehow sounds less like a space mission and more like the beginning of a children's cartoon from the 1960s. But the reality was tense. The flight reached suborbital space. The capsule traveled thousands of miles. And during the mission, scientists monitored breathing, heartbeat, and physical responses carefully. Then came the critical part, re-entry. Because getting into space was only half the problem. Coming back alive was the real challenge, and remarkably, they survived. Newspapers covered the story heavily. Photographers surrounded the animals. People became emotionally invested in them almost immediately. There's something very human about that, too. The second living creatures survive something dangerous and unknown, people start assigning personality to the event. Abel unfortunately died a few days later during a medical procedure unrelated to the flight itself. But Baker lived for decades afterward and became something oddly close to a national celebrity. Visitors brought her gifts. People mailed fan letters. Children wanted to see the space monkey. And what fascinates me most about these early space stories is how experimental everything felt. Today, space history can sound inevitable in hindsight. Of course humans went to space. Of course moon landings happened. But in 1959, none of that felt guaranteed. The future still looked uncertain enough that sending two monkeys upward inside a missile counted as one of the most important scientific tests on Earth. And then there are moments when a single person unexpectedly proves that enormous systems are far less secure than they appear. On May 28, 1987, an 18-year-old West German named Matthias Rust did something that sounded impossible. He flew a small private plane directly into Soviet airspace, passed through Soviet defenses, and landed near Red Square in Moscow during the Cold War, which honestly sounds less like history and more like the setup for a satirical movie somebody would reject for being unrealistic. The Soviet Union maintained one of the largest military defense systems on Earth. This was a superpower, a nuclear power, a state built heavily around security, surveillance, and military strength. And then a teenager in a tiny Cessna airplane somehow slipped through the layers of defense systems and reached the center of Moscow. The entire incident reportedly caused confusion at multiple levels. Radar operators noticed him. Some officials assumed the aircraft was friendly. Others hesitated to react because of earlier Soviet mistakes involving civilian aircraft. And Rust just kept flying. Eventually, he landed near St. Basil's Cathedral after narrowly avoiding traffic and pedestrians. People reportedly approached him casually asking where he came from, which is an incredible contrast to the geopolitical panic happening behind the scenes. The Soviet government was humiliated. Military officials lost positions. Security failures became impossible to ignore. And internationally, the event damaged the image of Soviet invulnerability. But what's interesting is that Rust himself later described the mission partly as a symbolic peace flight, which feels almost surreal considering how dangerous the situation could have become. Because during the Cold War, misunderstandings involving aircraft could become catastrophic very quickly. And yet somehow, this strange little plane crossed one of the most militarized regions in the world and landed beside tourists. History occasionally produces moments so bizarre that they temporarily expose how fragile giant systems really are. And one thing I kept noticing while working through today's stories was how quickly people become attached to personalities once they enter public imagination. Cars become cultural symbols. Animals become celebrities. Even accidental pilots become international headlines. And speaking of unforgettable public personalities, born on May 28, 1907 in Cleveland, Ohio, Burgess Meredith became one of those rare actors whose face people recognized instantly, even if they don't know his name. And his career lasted so long that he somehow became culturally important to multiple completely different generations. To some people, he was Mickey from Rocky. To others, he was the Penguin from the 1960s Batman series. To Twilight Zone fans, he was the nervous book lover in Time Enough to Last. And somehow all of those performances felt completely different. Meredith had this unusual ability to feel theatrical and human at the same time. He could play comedy, intensity, exhaustion, warmth, sometimes all within a single scene. He also had one of those faces that carried life experience visibly. Not polished, not distant, He looked like someone who had actually lived through things. And honestly, that's probably part of why audiences trusted him on screen. There's a scene in Rocky where Mickey quietly tells Rocky, "You're gonna eat lightning and crap thunder," which sounds ridiculous written down. But Burgess Meredith somehow delivered lines like that with complete sincerity, and that's a genuine skill. Something about today's stories kept returning to movement. Cars reshaped ordinary life. Animals crossing the edge of space. A teenager crossing borders nobody thought he could cross. And what stood out to me is how often human beings build systems that feel permanent, until suddenly someone moves through them differently. A road changes a city. A rocket changes science. A tiny airplane changes geopolitics. And once movement changes, people start seeing the world differently afterward. Anyway, that's where all this somehow landed today. And before we close things out, here's today's surprisingly revealing quote. "I am free because I know that I alone am morally responsible for everything I do." Robert A. Heinlein. If you'd like to hear more of my work or see other corners of the internet I've been quietly building things in, you can head over to waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns. Thanks for hanging out with me for a few minutes. I'll see you tomorrow.